Hello, Davos 2012. Joining me now, Michael Andrews, Chairman of KPMG International. Mr. Andrews, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Menaka.
Well, we've been discussing for the last 2 days, and in fact for the last several months now, the uncertainty in the Eurozone, the American economy on the mend, the pressure on emerging markets. In the context of this global economic situation, what do you think are some of the key challenges that global business leaders are facing, and how do you think they're coping with them?
I think the challenge is at two levels, Menaka. I think the first one is the economic challenge, which you've referred to. And I think European business leaders are sort of getting sensitised to the fact there's going to be a long, slow workout of the Eurozone issues and tackling some of the major problems. But they've got to get on and do business anyway.
Right.
So they're really starting to adapt their business models and their risk management models for different scenarios, which means diversifying their risk, looking towards emerging markets, looking to those markets where they're not currently positioned, and trying to really have a strategic priority. The second thing I think is coming through is just trying to tackle the obvious social and political issue that's occurring at the moment, where there's a lot of criticism of business at the moment, and a lot of lack of trust in capital markets. And business leaders at Davos are really trying to, I think about how to respond in a very effective way to actually emphasise the important role that business plays in society.
All right, let me come to the first part of your answer, and that is new risk models, diversifying business. It has been said several times that large corporates in America, in Europe, even in emerging markets, are sitting on large piles of cash, not sure where to invest them, how to invest them, when to invest them. Have you heard in your conversations with business leaders here in Davos today that if this uncertain period prolongs, they're going to have to find a way to put that money back to work? They can't sit on it for too long. So how are they going about strategizing that?
Well, first thing is they're trying to get clarity on the liquidity in the banking system. And I think some of the recent moves by the ECB of making available short-term liquidity have actually eased that issue a little bit. So there's a growing confidence now that funding will be available, which impacts a number of segments of the economy.
Right.
So they're now starting to, I think, plan more aggressively about their investment strategies, whether that be investing in new markets or whether that be looking at acquisitions of companies that actually require capital at this stage of the cycle.
So we can see, in fact, the investment cycle restart maybe towards the second half of this year?
I think that's exactly right. And I think there's a few things that will actually drive that. The liquidity in the system that you've referred to. But equally, I think you're going to see more fiscal stimulus in the US in the lead up to the election.
Okay.
And equally China, with the transition of leadership and the next 5-year plan executed, you're going to see the two largest economies in fairly resilient and robust form. And I think that'll actually give confidence to a number of the investors in the marketplace who want to get in early and take advantage of those opportunities.
All right, when you say that businesses are looking to diversify to emerging markets, now the BRIC story, the Brazil, Russia, India, China story is quite well known. Within that, some countries have faced considerable headwinds. Like in India, we've been battling inflation for the last 2 years. China is finally slowing down, and nobody's quite sure this year whether they'll grow at 9%, 8% or 7%. Are companies looking at newer markets, and what would those newer geographies be? Are they looking at newer consumer segments? I know one company was talking to me about taking some of the innovation they had done in the larger emerging markets to, let's say, South Africa or other parts of Latin America. So how is that process working?
That's a very good question, and that's one of the themes we're seeing in emerging markets starting to trade with each other and see those opportunities. Because the models that work well in India, frankly, work very well in Africa. You have large populations, relatively low incomes,
Absolutely.
but a great need for middle-class types of goods, which India has successfully been able to introduce throughout its country. And so many people are starting to study this model now and realise that this is a key success factor for the future. In terms of new markets too, I mean, there are markets like the Middle East, also in Latin America and Korea are opening up significantly. So there's almost a competition for market entry and capital among these new and emerging nations.
All right. The second part of your answer had to do with, I think, the several protests that have brought home to business the fact that the distribution of wealth needs to be more equitable. What is business, or how is business reacting to this? The Occupy protests across the world. In India, we had a huge anti-corruption rally the last 2 years, led by a well-known social reformer. So I'm just curious as to how business is trying to react to this on the one hand, and very heavy regulatory interventions on the other. Because the moment you have all that regulatory intervention, you're finding ways around that, and then you're dealing with issues of either corruption or unfair behaviour, all of which is linked into each other, maybe.
Well, regulation is a great constraint on business, but business is well ahead of regulators in actually addressing this issue. We understand the issues that are actually coming out. You're seeing it in executive remuneration. You're seeing it in the corruption protests in India. You're actually seeing a generation saying, we want responsible leadership.
Absolutely.
And so the word responsible capitalism is now coming through. And that means looking at not just the shareholders' interests, which has been the traditional model of how business is driven, but who's the broader set of stakeholders? How do I engage my workforce and make sure that they're not dislocated through remuneration policies? What are the stakeholders out there that I should be serving? How can I lift the living standards in my community? What should I do as a business leader to actually demonstrate the economic consequences of my actions and how that actually adds to society? And if you do that, you engage your workforce, you engage your customers, and you engage suppliers. So the really responsible organisations see this as being a brand, reputational issue. So remuneration is a very good issue. Everyone's talked about this.
Right.
What we're now seeing is boards really aggressively look at restructuring these schemes to actually take out some of the really bad behaviours we've seen in recent years and be much more transparent in the way they actually communicate their strategy, how that fits as to why they remunerate the executives in that role, and explain that more openly, not just to their shareholders, but to the market generally.
Could you elaborate a bit on that board bit? Because I'm wondering how companies are... So I understand that they're picking up the message they're getting from people. I'm just wondering how they're able to sort of use that to change their business models.
Well, a good example is in many countries the board is almost appointed by the management team. There's not a great alignment. Increasingly now you're seeing a separation between strong board governance and the executive team. And the boards are taking more responsibility for ensuring that remuneration compensation schemes more fairly reflect the strategy and brand reputation that they'd like to see from that organisation.
Okay, the final theme I wanted to talk to you about is the new regulatory proposals that audit firms across the world are facing. The key proposal being of audit rotation. And there seem to be two drivers to that, both the attempt to try and raise audit quality in the face of all the, the financial collapse, etc., that we've seen in the last few years. And equally, I think in Europe, the concern has been the dominance of the Big Four. How do you react to these proposals, and how effective do you think they're going to be able to meet both these key concerns?
Well, I think go back to the start and say, why is this debate happening? And I think people have lost confidence in capital markets. It doesn't matter whether it's rating agencies, prudential regulators, investment banks, auditors. We all have a role to play and say, look, let's sit back and see what happened in recent years and how can we actually improve the outcome of this. Right. We don't think, though, that the proposals in Europe actually address the issue. The issue is, how can we... Well, what is it that investors need assurance on? And things like rotation or separating audit firms actually will potentially diminish audit quality, not actually improve audit quality. We would much prefer that there be discussion about what is the critical information that markets need to actually give more confidence in the underlying financial information that's provided to you. And good examples would be, most investors rely upon analyst statements that are actually put out in the marketplace. These are not audited. What are the critical facts? If you do a takeover, who knows that the synergies have been achieved? What's your cost to income ratio that so many people look at in financial institutions? So we should actually have a broader break and discussion about what it will actually take to make sure the credible information comes out in the marketplace. Audit rotation is a perception issue. The reality is this will impose a huge cost to business. The second thing is that just most audit failures occur in the first 2 years of a change of auditor. So these sort of risks that you actually put into the system.
You might be enhancing the risk of an audit failure or a poor audit if you insist on rotation.
I think you will. That's why in the US you've seen in the discussion paper released by the PCAOB a very strong negative reaction from the business community who understand that this might well happen.
Do you think, though, that maybe these proposals, if they're turned into rules or law, will go some way in breaking the dominance or the perceived dominance of the Big Four? Because that clearly is one big concern in the EU as well. Well,
and again, the question is, why is it a concern? Because it's the most competitive market you can possibly imagine. Every time that there is a major audit proposal or advisory proposal, you could not get a more competitive group of people. The second thing I think that people really miss is to actually sustain a global network is a huge cost. And we spend $600 million a year basically making sure that we are investing in audit quality, in new technology, opening new marketplaces. This requires a very, very substantial global balance sheet to be able to really instill consistent quality across the globe. And as organisations become much more global, they need to be able to have the same audit quality in 140 countries in which we operate. And it's very hard for very small audit firms to actually be able to make that type of investment.
But you wouldn't say that it is disturbing that currently, when it comes to global companies, the Big Four do dominate their audit work, do dominate their consulting work, and maybe that framework needs to change.
So it's a quality issue. I mean, at the end of the day, you have a strong brand. You actually look at where the problems actually occur in the capital markets, and it's not really a Big Four problem. It's generally when people go away from the Big Four that those are the sort of issues, or the Big Four or the Big Six, that actually these things occur. So, for example, recently you've seen the problems with Chinese IPOs in the US. Most of those have been done by local Chinese firms. You know, there's very few associated with the Big Four firms. There's always going to be audit failure, but it's a microcosm in terms of the actual number of audits and opinions that we actually give on a regular basis. I mean, quality is absolutely paramount to us. We have a global brand. We just can't afford to get it wrong in any individual marketplace because it reflects globally on what we do.
All right, that's a fair argument. The last question on this theme being that I think the proposals also include restraining audit firms from offering non-audit services. Again, as part of trying to meet both those concerns of conflict and dominance. How is that going to change the revenue model of Big Four if it does come to pass?
Yeah, look, I think it will change the revenue model. I should say that there are a number of these proposals we actually support to actually improve audit quality. And in terms of audit services, there's clearly been some excesses in certain situations where I can see that the public would lose confidence in that sort of position. So I think to get some clarity, though, is important around the rules. For example, in the United States, we have a very clear set of rules for SEC-listed companies as to what we can and can't do. Those rules have applied and worked successfully for 10 years. So why can't we have a global standard around this? It will change our business model in certain circumstances, and it will actually introduce, I think, some possibilities for us in certain markets and some loss of business in other markets. And it may well see the introduction of other advisory firms or other legal firms in some of the areas where traditionally we have been very strong.
All right, despite your arguments, and I must say they're not just your arguments, most of the audit firms that I talk to anywhere else in the world and in India, where audit rotation is about to become law, are opposed to the idea simply because they don't really think it's going to make any material difference to audit quality. But despite all of this, if these rules did in fact come into play, do you see that the Big Four might in fact become the Big Eight or the Big Ten a few years down the line?
I mean, the history of this, remember, we were a Big Eight.
I know.
Okay, and then we had Edison's collapse, and we had some mergers that were allowed.
Yeah.
I think inevitably at some stage there's going to be consolidation in the second tier. I think in some of the emerging and developing markets, some of those will spawn, globally based audit companies over time. So I don't expect the Big Four to stay forever. The market, I think, will adjust. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a large Chinese audit firm or a large Indian audit firm over a period of time start to emerge.
All right. I appreciate you responding to all my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Menaka. Thank you very much.